Imagine standing exactly at the North Pole. Face south, because that is the only direction left. Now point north. You cannot do it. Not because your compass is broken or the weather is too harsh. You cannot point north because the question itself has collapsed. What lies north of the North Pole sounds like a real question. It has a subject, a verb, the correct grammar of an inquiry, but the geometry of the Earth makes it impossible to answer. The words describe a destination that does not exist. For decades, scientists and philosophers have circled an equally impossible question about the human mind. They call it the hard problem of consciousness. Neuroscience handles a massive list of functions that we call the easy problems, mapping how the eye focuses light, how the cortex carves out edges, or how a pain signal races up the spinal cord. We map the circuits, and the physical mechanism explains the action. Then there is the hard problem. Why is any of that mechanical processing accompanied by an inner glow? Why is there a felt quality, an experience of seeing red, rather than all that data crunching silently in the dark? Look closely at a brain scan, and you see electrical impulses and chemical handoffs. You never see the feeling itself. A gap yawns open between the physical wiring on the screen and the private, subjective feeling of being alive. We treat that gap as the deepest mystery in science, assuming there is a missing ingredient waiting to be discovered. We rarely stop to ask if the question itself is mathematically rigged. To solve this, we have to stop asking how physical matter creates magic. We need to ask a very different question. Why is a biological machine so intensely convinced that it has magic inside it? Philosopher David Chalmers calls this the meta-problem. It pivots the camera away from the mysterious inner light and focuses entirely on the insistence. It asks why we report, write books about, and stubbornly defend the idea that an unexplainable soul sits behind our eyes. Your insistence that you have a private, subjective consciousness is an action. Saying the words aloud or feeling certain about it in your head are physical events driven by synapses, neurons, and vocal cords. It is a mechanical output. If we map the physical mechanisms that cause a brain to swear it possesses an unexplainable soul, we no longer need the soul to make the math work. The mystery evaporates, replaced by a clear blueprint of a machine doing its job. An adult human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, firing in intricate patterns to keep the body alive, upright, and moving through a dangerous world. If you had to consciously track every single voltage spike to walk across a room, your system would instantly overload and crash. Evolution solved that data crisis by compressing the noise. It built a control surface. A highly simplified, cartoon summary of reality that lets you steer the organism without drowning in the source code. Think of the desktop on your computer. When you drag a blue folder into the trash, you are interacting with a useful fiction. There is no actual blue folder. There is a sprawling matrix of magnetized regions on a hard drive that you will never see. The interface works by hiding the hardware. Your brain uses that same trick. When you look at an apple, you experience the color red. You do not feel the visual cortex isolating wavelengths, nor the memory centers matching shapes. The processing is completely invisible to you. What you call consciousness is the biological interface. It presents you with a smooth, finished product because it was brilliantly engineered to hide its own wiring from the user. The trap snaps shut when we try to look inward. When the brain inspects its own experience, it hits the interface again. It finds a smooth, sourceless feeling with no physical parts and incorrectly assumes it must be made of non-physical spirit. Picture a fuel gauge on a dashboard. The needle is pinned at full. The gauge represents a full tank, but there is no actual gasoline sloshing around inside the plastic dial. And if the tank underneath is completely bone dry, the gauge will still confidently display full. The brain generates an unshakable, real reading that an intrinsic, private light exists inside you. The gauge is real, the needle is real, the confident report is real. The thing it claims to measure simply does not exist. Your overwhelming certainty that you possess an immaterial soul does not prove there is one. You are dealing with a biological gauge that misreads its own empty tank. We get confused when we double-click our biological icons, expecting to reach the hardware. We search for the physical location of the color red, or the exact weight of a memory, and find nothing but wet tissue. We mistake the representation for reality. We take the brain's convenient summary of an event and treat it as a separate magical ingredient floating somewhere above the neurons. Hearing this triggers a deep human fear. If the inner light is a user illusion, it feels like our pain, our love, and our grief are suddenly cheapened, reduced to cold robotic data. Dislating the hard problem takes nothing away from you. The reality of suffering was never lodged in a metaphysical glow hovering behind the machinery. The grief and the joy are entirely intact. We have only discarded a fairy tale we told ourselves about how they work. When you burn your hand, the alarm screaming through your nervous system is the authentic pain. The physical tissue damage, the chemical flood, the shrieking, coordinated fact to a whole animal in distress. Brain activity is not a sterile proxy for human emotion. The firing circuitry is the hurting. The neural pathways wiring together over years are the literal embodiment of love. 14 billion years ago, there was only unlit matter. Over eons, that matter folded itself into stars, into chemistry, and eventually into biological arrangements complex enough to model their environment, and then to model themselves. You are not a ghost haunting a meat machine. You are a stretch of the physical universe that has curved back on itself to keep track of its own existence. A piece of ordinary matter that has, for a short and improbable window of time, just noticed that it is on.